Arguably, the success of America is dependent on the strength and success of presidential leadership. What are the characteristics of leadership embodied and developed by our past presidents, and how might we use that insight to help us choose high-quality candidates for America's future? William Haldeman is a presidential historian, author of the new book, Meeting the Moment, Inspiring Presidential Leadership That Transformed America. Bill joins me now. Bill, it's good to see you. So I found the book fascinating, and you identify 6 leadership characteristics over history and over time. We'll go through some of them or all of them, but I just want to ask, like some of the earlier folks, the Washingtons, the Lincolns, you didn't have social media, you didn't have television or radio. When you get to FDR, as you use him, you do get radio, some television. Did that influence your selection of leadership characteristics, the advent of media in all forms?
Well, the aspect of communication played into all of them. So all of the presidents that I profile in this work, there's a central document in America that are critical to American history, from Washington's farewell address to Ronald Reagan's Berlin Wall speech. So every aspect of that in terms of communication is central to that. And FDR, he was critical at a key moment when the radio was the proliferation of the radio. You see John Kennedy with the proliferation of television, and you certainly see that with Donald Trump in the aspect of social media. So that certainly played into the aspect of this book for sure.
Let's talk about some of these characteristics so people know. You have a president who kind of represents that characteristic. You could have chosen others, but I will note you have Democrats and Republicans. Nobody can accuse you of being biased as you walk through this. The first one is judgment. You do use George Washington, but interestingly, you note Washington made some bad decisions, but it is that farewell address. It's that decision to step down after 2 terms. He wasn't required to do that.
Correct. And I go back to the judgment of Washington in the sense that he wasn't classically educated. He didn't have the education of a John Adams or a Thomas Jefferson. But what he learned through doing. His combat essentially became his classroom. And for him, judgment was an inherent aspect of wisdom. So for him, the farewell address in 1796 was the culmination of 4 decades of him learning and getting things wrong, but also getting things right. If you look at the American Revolution, he lost more battles than he won. Yeah. But he was someone that learned from his mistakes. He was someone that got the big things right. And I think about someone like Michael Jordan. You think about you wanted him with the ball at the end of the game. George Washington was the same way. He got the big things done right. And he was also the person you wanted with the 4th quarter on the line.
Well, you're talking to Chicago, so we wanted Michael Jordan with the ball at all times. But ingenuity, you use Thomas Jefferson there. Interestingly, you say his writings actually, which of course were amazing, Declaration of Independence, but actually led to the Louisiana Purchase. He was a true driver of American growth.
Totally. And that was something that, I mean, from his experience as a diplomat in France, he was able to have that sense of ingenuity to push the French at a critical point in American history. So the Mississippi River, as we know in the Midwest, was everything. It was, as James Madison called it, it was the Hudson, it was the Delaware, and the Potomac, and all of the rivers of the Atlantic states rolled into one. It was everything. And Jefferson pushed the limits in terms of his diplomacy, in terms of the Louisiana Purchase, used back channels with the French to help kind of work through that process. He emboldened his ambassador to France, Robert Livingston, to come through with a deal. And in the end, it was one of the most important land deals in American history, but one of the most important moments in American history.
We're only about halfway through. I want to do quickly with these other ones so I can get to some other questions. But you look to Lincoln for dedication, pointing to his Gettysburg Address, only 272 words. But it's interesting. You talk about the fact that he wanted the North to stay the course, but at the same time, as I understand, Lincoln had slavery been the way the country was going, he would have supported that too. He was pragmatic.
Well, that year, 1863, and on January 1st, which was the anniversary of that of the Emancipation Proclamation, he signed that proclamation to remove slavery from the South, essentially, and as a way of also garnering support for the Northern effort during the war. And I think Lincoln's ultimately, I would argue that he was talking about in the Gettysburg Address about freedom and what it meant to the nation to be wholly free. And his whole purpose was to keep the Union together. And I think that that's what shows in his inherent dedication in that document in 272 words, as you note. Yeah. Six of those words in Lincoln was so minute in the word choices. 6 of those were dedicate or dedicated, which showed his inherent dedication to the Union.
Courage, you looked at Teddy Roosevelt and his environmental work, which interestingly, as we mourn Jimmy Carter now, he is often called the next sort of Teddy Roosevelt in his environmental work. But for courage, you could have looked to JFK, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Truman, the courage of dropping the bomb, right or wrong, however you view it, and LBJ stepping down. Many presidents exemplify some of these characteristics like courage.
Of course, and I think in the book highlights some of those to show across the swath of American history. I mean, presidents have shown courage. Look at Lincoln in terms of the Civil War. Look at Washington in terms of squashing the Whiskey Rebellion. I mean, across the board, I certainly struggled with that aspect of looking at Kennedy in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as you note. But I think about that in the context of it's a critical issue of his time. That wasn't in the cloakrooms of the United States Congress, but it was something that he looked at as something that was inherently important to him. Conservation, from his experience in the Badlands after the death of his wife and his mother on the same day, Valentine's Day, 1884, he went there to heal, and he learned that aspect of conservation. It became part of him, so much that became on his first State of the Union address after the death of William McKinley. He put that aspect into the State of the Union. It was about 10-12% of his draft was focused on that at such a time when it wasn't a critical focus of the nation, but it was an existential threat to the nation, and that was important for him to do so.
And other features like confidence and optimism. So much to talk about, so little time, but we got through much of it, and I'll have more to talk to you about someday. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you, Paul. Have a great day. Appreciate you.
You too. The book is called Meeting the Moment, Inspiring Presidential Leadership That Transformed America. For more information, check out social media or visit WilliamHaldeman.com. Stay with us. We'll be right back.